keeping with their promise to fundamentally transform the country, Joe Biden and the Democrats have done everything in their power to fundamentally transform the federal judiciary. As a member of the Judiciary Committee, I've been able to interact with many of these nominees, and I have to say that I fully believe the American people deserve better. There was Charnel Bilkengren, Joe Biden's nominee to the Eastern District of Washington. Now, she couldn't tell the committee what Article 2 of the Constitution says, but I expect my Democratic colleagues will send her nomination to the floor this Thursday. Dale Ho, who received the unanimous support of committee Democrats to serve in the Southern District of New York, referred to himself as, and I quote, a wild-eyed sort of leftist, end quote, and disparaged members of the committee on Twitter. Before she was nominated to serve on the Fourth Circuit, DeAndrea Benjamin released multiple people on bond who went on to commit more violent crimes. She, too, received unanimous support of committee Democrats. Todd Edelman, who is well on his way to becoming a district judge here in the District of Columbia, also displayed soft on crime tendencies. He released a known criminal who then went on to participate in the murder of a child. He received yet another vote of unanimous support from committee Democrats. Marian Gaston, nominee to the Southern District of California, wrote a policy paper arguing that we should do away with residence restrictions for convicted child sex offenders. Aurelia Merchant, nominee to the Eastern District of New York, couldn't define originalism. Mr. President, this is an embarrassment, and it gets even worse. When you look at the lack of qualification of the nominees, the Democrats are sending for lifetime appointments to the federal bench. Now, few nominations have been as disturbing as President Biden's elevation of Michael Delaney to the First Circuit to date. Mr. Delaney's most noteworthy contribution to his profession is the vicious intimidation of an underage sexual assault survivor who dared to speak out against one of his clients. My colleagues on the Judiciary Committee already know the story of what Mr. Delaney did to Chessie Prout and her family, but I'm going to repeat it here for my colleagues who are unfamiliar with this nominee's background. You should vote against this nominee, and here is why. When she was a freshman at the elite St. Paul's boarding school, Chessie Prout was sexually assaulted by an older student participating in Senior Salute. This was a campus-wide competition that encouraged senior men to commit statutory rape. The perpetrator was ultimately found guilty of misdemeanor statutory rape, but the Prouts wanted their day in court with the civil suit. They had evidence that the powers that be at St. Paul's knew about this sick tradition. Mr. Delaney represented the school, and he decided he was going to play hardball. He moved to have Chessie, who was a minor child, named publicly in a lawsuit that had garnered national attention. That is right. Let's publicly name this child in a lawsuit that had garnered national attention. I would ask my colleagues, does that sound like an action that someone who is going to sit on the federal bench should be taking? Now, Mr. Delaney knew that if he exposed Chessie as Jane Doe, he would put her at risk of bullying, social isolation, and physical harm. He knew that. But it was worth it to him because it meant he could silence Chessie Prout. And he could go on and protect an elite private school that had a sick tradition. Their leadership knew about that sick tradition. Well, most of my Republican colleagues came to Mr. Delaney's confirmation hearing and they questioned him about this action. Only 2 of my Democratic colleagues chose to attend the hearing and to question him. Why? Because even my friends on the other side of the aisle who have rubber-stamped each of President Biden's unqualified nominees, no matter how controversial they were, they knew this guy, Mr. Delaney, he is unfit to sit on the bench. I would say 2 things to Chairman Durbin and the rest of my Democratic colleagues on the Judiciary Committee. First, even a cursory glance at this nominee's record should have landed his file in the trash can. You don't do this. You do not do this to minor children. But now that his nomination is facing a vote, you need look no further into Mr. Delaney's record than what has already been laid out before us. He harassed and threatened a 15-year-old little girl who survived a sexual assault and who was just trying to protect other young women at that school from that same fate. That should be enough for every single member on the Judiciary Committee to oppose this nomination. It should be enough for every member of this chamber to oppose his nomination and confirmation. Confirming Mr. Delaney would send a chilling message to victims of sexual assault. No victim would ever be able to walk into his courtroom and feel that they would be treated fairly under the law after seeing the way he treated Chessie Prout. I want to let Chessie speak for herself in a letter she submitted to the Judiciary Committee. My concern is that many of my colleagues in this chamber have not seen this letter. Indeed, Mr. President, I'm concerned that members of the Democratic caucus who did not attend the hearing are unaware of this letter. So I will allow her to speak, and I quote, "If Michael Delaney is confirmed, if an attorney who brazenly intimidated a minor victim of sexual assault is given the distinct privilege to serve as a judge for the United States Court of Appeals, you, meaning every single one of you that would vote for him, you are telling victims and survivors that you not only approve of victim intimidation tactics, you reward their enactors with one of the highest legal appointments in the state of Massachusetts. I expressed my concerns to the Department of Justice when Michael Delaney was first nominated in April of 2022, and today I am urging you to vote no to Michael Delaney's nomination," end quote. Mr. President, I ask that Chessie's full letter be printed in the record alongside my remarks.
Without objection.
Thank you. The White House knew that Mr. Delaney was unfit to serve, but they nominated him anyway. For the sake of young men and women around this country who are survivors of sexual assault, I urge President Biden to withdraw Michael Delaney's nomination. And I call on my Democratic colleagues to urge the White House to withdraw this nomination. And if they do not withdraw this nomination of a man who intimidated a minor child, exposing a minor child, unfit to serve, I urge you, vote no if the White House does not pull this nomination. Mr. President, I ask that the remainder of my remarks be placed separately in the record.
Without objection.
Thank you. Joe Biden's reckless border policies have allowed human trafficking and smuggling to grow into a $13 billion industry, with criminal cartels earning up to $14 million every day for trafficking families, women, and children into the country. I want to be crystal clear about what's happening here. This is not some sort of humanitarian mission. The cartels are not doing this out of the goodness of their heart. These are violent criminals who have figured out how to make millions of dollars every single day. They are kidnapping young girls and exploiting them for sex and labor over and over again. The left wants you to believe this is a myth, or that reports of trafficking and exploitation are exaggerated. But while I was down on the border, I heard from two women who can provide a mountain of evidence to the contrary. Former Mexican Congresswoman Rosa Maria de la Garza joined us to talk about her advocacy on behalf of survivors of this horrific abuse. She was dedicated all her life. She puts her time into preventing and targeting human trafficking in her own country. And she has seen firsthand the ease with which the cartels use our open border to make a buck, and how they expand the slave trade into our country, profiting from it. We also had the chance to speak with Carla Romero, who is a survivor of cross-border sex trafficking. Carla fell into the hands of her captors when she was 12 years old and was enslaved as a sex-trafficked individual for 4 years. During that time, she estimates that she was raped over 40,000 times. A child in the hands of a cartel. That is what they did to her. This is a humanitarian catastrophe that is enabled not only by the Biden administration's refusal to secure the border, but by incentives buried in the law that encourage criminal behavior. At the end of last year, the Justice Department committed over $90 million in funding to combat human trafficking. It's an incredible investment of taxpayer resources, but unbelievably enough, the American people are subsidizing the lifestyles of these criminals, even as they invest millions to bring down these trafficking rings. As it stands right now, the law allows accused traffickers to live in government housing and receive government benefits even after they are apprehended by law enforcement and charged with a crime. If we're going to get serious about combating trafficking at the border, we need to eliminate this incentive for illegal conduct. Now, Mr. President, I know it seems unbelievable that you have these cartel members that are getting U.S. government benefits, living in government housing, getting unemployment checks, but it is happening. Now, the Remain in Mexico policy is a prime example of how successful tactics can work. by requiring asylum seekers to stay in Mexico while awaiting a court date, we ensured that migrants weren't rewarded for illegally crossing the border. These programs work, and that's why I, along with Senator Hyde-Smith and Senator Brent, introduced the Stop Taxpayer Funding of Traffickers Act. It makes clear that anyone charged with drug or human trafficking at our border cannot receive federal government benefits until their case is resolved. It would block them from receiving any retirement, welfare, Social Security, health or disability benefits. It also means that traffickers would not be able to receive a grant, contract, loan, professional or commercial license from the U.S. government. This is something that needs to happen. Prohibiting traffickers from receiving taxpayer funds is just plain common sense. And there's no reason why this legislation shouldn't pass the Senate immediately. I can't imagine that anyone would be for allowing these drug traffickers and sex traffickers to continue to live in government housing and receive these benefits. In the same way that drug traffickers are directly profiting from the opioid epidemic that has killed millions of Americans, human traffickers are reaping the rewards of this administration's complacency. It's time to start paying attention to some of the details of what is happening at our southern border. The American people are paying attention, and they're waiting on this president and on this body to join them in doing something about it. I yield the floor.